On the evening of August 29, 1995, police are called to a home in Springfield, Illinois. Inside, officers find two bodies. One is Donnah Winger, a young mother, discovered dead in her bed. The other is Roger Harrington, her former husband, lying nearby, beaten to death. The man who made the call is Mark Winger, Donnah's husband. He tells investigators he was asleep when Harrington broke into the house. He claims he acted in self-defense to protect his family. At first, his story is accepted. There are no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence to contradict his account. Years later, forensic evidence forces investigators to look again. What once appeared justified begins to raise serious doubts. Mark Winger did not attract attention. In Springfield, Illinois, he lived a life that from the outside appeared ordinary and predictable in the way many suburban lives do. He was not a public figure. He was not known for conflict. There was nothing about him that suggested volatility or instability. To neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, he was simply another resident, present but unremarkable. Winger was employed as a state revenue officer for Illinois. His work placed him within the administrative structure of state government, dealing with compliance, enforcement, and financial regulation. It was a position that required accuracy, documentation, and adherence to established procedures. The role carried authority, but not visibility. It was the kind of job that rarely draws scrutiny unless something goes wrong. There were no records of disciplinary issues in his employment history, no complaints, no warnings. His professional life did not suggest recklessness or impulsivity. He appeared capable of functioning within institutional frameworks that rely on predictability and rule following. In social settings, Winger was described as quiet and reserved. He did not dominate conversations or seek attention. He was present, but often emotionally contained. People who interacted with him did not recall strong opinions or dramatic behavior. His demeanor was controlled, measured, and restrained. This presentation extended into his private life. Winger was married to Donnah Winger, a registered nurse. Donnah was often described as approachable and communicative, more socially engaged than her husband. She maintained relationships with friends and family and was seen as active in her role as a mother. Together, they lived with their daughter Bailey, who was 3 years old at the time. The household appeared typical for a young family. There were no reports of repeated disturbances, no known involvement of police or social services prior to August 1995. The family did not draw attention from neighbors or authorities. To those outside the marriage, the relationship appeared stable. There were no public disputes, no visible breakdowns, no known threats or complaints. The absence of documented conflict would later influence how initial accounts of the crime were received. Winger's behavior contributed to that perception. He did not display overt aggression. He did not raise concerns through erratic actions. His interactions suggested self-control rather than emotional volatility. When people later tried to recall warning signs, there were few to identify. This is not to say that the marriage was without tension. Like many relationships, it contained disagreements and stressors, but those tensions were not visible to the outside world in a way that suggested imminent violence. There were no protective orders, no emergency calls, no documented attempts to leave the relationship that required outside intervention. Financial pressures existed, as they do in many households. Responsibilities were divided between work and childcare. Donnah balanced nursing shifts with parenting. Winger worked full-time. Their life was structured around those obligations, without obvious deviation. What mattered for the investigation later was not whether the marriage was perfect, but whether there were observable indicators of danger. There were not. This absence of outward instability shaped how Mark Winger was initially perceived. When police later entered his home, they did not encounter a known offender or a volatile individual. They encountered a man whose background aligned with expectations of reliability and normalcy. Winger's appearance reinforced that image. He did not look disheveled or distressed in ways that suggested loss of control. His communication with authorities was calm. He did not behave in a manner that immediately triggered suspicion. This mattered because credibility is often shaped by context. Winger's professional role, lack of criminal history, and controlled demeanor positioned him as someone whose statements would be taken seriously. There was nothing in his background that required investigators to immediately doubt him. In the days that followed, This perception allowed an explanation to take hold, one that fit both the scene and the man describing it. That explanation would not have carried the same weight if delivered by someone with a history of violence or instability. Winger's life up to that point had not prepared those around him to question his account. He had lived within systems that rewarded compliance and predictability. He had presented himself as a responsible adult and parent. He had not violated social expectations in a way that would undermine trust. This trust was not the result of manipulation alone. It was built on years of uneventful existence. The absence of prior incidents created a vacuum in which alternative explanations could be accepted without resistance. It is important to understand this context because it explains how the initial narrative survived. Investigations do not occur in isolation. They are shaped by assumptions, prior knowledge, and the credibility of the individuals involved. At this point in the story, Mark Winger was not a suspect in the conventional sense. He was a husband who had called police, a father still responsible for a young child, a state employee with no known history of violence. There was no obvious reason to suspect that the events inside his home had been staged or misrepresented. The circumstances allowed for an explanation that aligned with his image. That image, quiet, controlled, ordinary, was not questioned immediately. Only later would investigators begin to separate appearance from action. Only later would the details beneath the surface be examined closely enough to challenge what had initially been accepted. For now, Mark Winger remained what he had always appeared to be, a man living an unexceptional life in Springfield, Illinois, whose actions had not yet been scrutinized beyond their surface explanation. The stability that defined his public life would soon be tested, not by rumor or speculation, but by evidence that required closer examination. And when that examination began, the assumptions built on years of normalcy would start to unravel. Before the events of August 29, 1995, the life Mark Winger shared with his wife was not shaped solely by the present. Part of its context lay in Donnah Winger's past, a history that would later become central to how the crime was first understood and why an initial explanation was accepted with little resistance. Before marrying Mark Winger, Donnah Winger had been married to Roger Harrington. Their relationship had ended years earlier, but the separation had not produced a clean break. The divorce did not result in long-term stability for Harrington, and his circumstances deteriorated steadily in the years that followed. By the mid-1990s, Harrington's life was marked by instability. He struggled with consistent employment and housing. At times, he was effectively homeless, moving between temporary accommodations. His financial situation was precarious, and he relied intermittently on others for assistance. These conditions did not make him a criminal, but they placed him on the margins of stability. Harrington's connection to Donnah did not disappear after the divorce. He continued to contact her sporadically. These attempts were not secret, nor were they entirely unexpected. Former spouses do not always sever communication cleanly, particularly when unresolved issues remain. What mattered was how these interactions were later interpreted. Accounts from friends and family indicated that Harrington struggled to move on from the relationship. He expressed frustration and emotional distress over the divorce. At times, he appeared fixated on Donnah's new life. These behaviors were not unusual in isolation, but they contributed to a narrative that would later form around him. Mark Winger was aware of Harrington's existence and his prior relationship with Donnah. The presence of an ex-husband with an unstable life situation was not something the couple could completely ignore. However, there is no evidence that Harrington posed an immediate, documented threat in the period leading up to August 1995. There were no restraining orders in effect, no police reports alleging harassment or violence immediately preceding the incident. Whatever tensions existed between Donnah and Harrington were not formally escalated through law enforcement channels. Still, Harrington's situation made him visible. He was known to have reached out for help. He had limited resources, and he was emotionally tied to a past relationship that had moved on without him. These facts, taken together, would later shape assumptions. From an investigative standpoint, this background was significant because it introduced an external figure who could plausibly be linked to violence without immediate contradiction. When police encountered a scene involving two dead adults, one of them an ex-spouse, the connection required examination. Harrington's presence in the story did not initially raise questions about motive alone. It raised questions about access. He knew Donnah. He knew where she lived. He had a history with her that extended beyond casual acquaintance. These factors mattered when considering how he could have entered the home. At the same time, Harrington's unstable circumstances made him vulnerable to being framed as a disruptor. Individuals on the margins of stability are often perceived as unpredictable, even when evidence does not support that assumption. This perception would later influence how Mark Winger's explanation was received. According to Winger's later account, Harrington was an unwelcome presence, a man who could not accept the end of his marriage and who posed a potential threat. This framing aligned easily with what investigators already knew about Harrington's life. It did not require invention. It relied on existing facts interpreted in a particular way. In the days and weeks following the deaths, Harrington's background was examined closely. Investigators reviewed his history, his movements, and his known contacts. They confirmed that he had experienced housing instability and emotional distress. These findings were factual, not speculative. What they did not find initially was evidence that Harrington had planned violence. There were no documented threats made in the immediate lead-up to August 29th. No communications indicating intent to harm. No preparation suggesting an attack. Despite this absence, Harrington's profile fit neatly into a narrative of escalation. A former spouse, a troubled life, a man with reason to feel resentment. These elements made it easier to imagine him as the aggressor in a confrontation. This context is critical because it explains why the story Mark Winger told that night was not immediately challenged. His account did not introduce a random intruder or an unknown assailant. It identified someone with a plausible connection to the household. Harrington's existence provided an explanation that did not require complex speculation. It offered a recognizable figure whose presence could account for violence without demanding further proof in the early stages. The role Harrington played in the family's background also influenced how the deaths were emotionally processed. For investigators, cases involving domestic relationships often involve layered histories. Prior marriages, unresolved attachments, and ongoing contact can complicate motives and timelines. At this stage, Harrington was not viewed as a victim in the conventional sense. He was viewed as a participant whose actions required reconstruction. The fact that he was also deceased limited his ability to clarify events, further shaping the investigation's direction. Importantly, Harrington's past did not automatically imply guilt, but it created a context in which guilt seemed plausible enough to delay deeper scrutiny elsewhere. This distinction matters. The investigation did not begin with the assumption that Harrington was responsible. It began with the assumption that his involvement needed explanation. In cases involving multiple deaths within a single household, investigators often rely on existing relationships to guide early hypotheses. Harrington's relationship with Donnah made him the most obvious external figure to examine. What would later become clear is that Harrington's role in the story was less about his actions and more about how his presence shaped perception. His past made a particular version of events easier to accept. At this point in the timeline, no evidence had yet contradicted that version strongly enough to demand reevaluation. Harrington's background filled gaps that might otherwise have raised questions. His existence mattered not because it explained the crime, but because it explained why an explanation worked. As the investigation moved forward, this assumption would hold, for a time. Only later would investigators begin to reassess how much weight Harrington's past should have carried, and whether it had obscured more than it revealed. For now, his history remained a quiet but powerful influence on how the events of August 29, 1995, were understood. The events of August 29, 1995, unfolded inside the Winger home in Springfield, Illinois, without witnesses beyond those present in the house. What is known about that night comes from physical evidence, later forensic analysis, and the account provided by Mark Winger himself. In the early hours after the incident, his version of events shaped how the case was initially understood. According to Winger, the evening began without incident. He stated that he went to bed as usual, leaving his wife Donnah Winger in the home with their young daughter Bailey. There were no reported arguments that evening, no phone calls to police, and no disturbances noted by neighbors. Nothing about the hours leading up to the deaths suggested an imminent crisis. Winger later told investigators that he was asleep when the events began. He claimed that he was awakened by noises inside the house, sounds that immediately signaled danger. According to his account, when he left the bedroom, he encountered Roger Harrington, Donnah's former husband, inside the home. Winger stated that Harrington had entered the house without permission. He described Harrington as aggressive and threatening. In his telling, Harrington had already attacked Donnah, leaving her dead in the bedroom. Winger claimed that Harrington then confronted him, leading to a violent struggle. According to Winger, he grabbed a baseball bat and struck Harrington repeatedly in an effort to defend himself and protect his child. He maintained that his actions were driven by fear and necessity, not intent to kill. He portrayed the confrontation as chaotic, sudden, and unavoidable. When police arrived, they found 2 bodies inside the residence. Donnah Winger was discovered in the bedroom, lying on the bed. She showed no signs of defensive injuries consistent with a prolonged struggle. Her position suggested that she had been attacked while vulnerable. Initial observations did not immediately clarify the cause of death, but it was clear that she had not died naturally. Roger Harrington was found elsewhere in the house. He had suffered extensive head trauma. The injuries were severe and consistent with multiple blows from a blunt object. A baseball bat was recovered and identified as the weapon Winger claimed to have used. The scene itself appeared controlled rather than chaotic. There was no sign of forced entry into the home. Doors and windows were intact. Furniture was largely undisturbed. There was no widespread damage that would typically accompany a violent break-in or extended fight between 2 adult men. Winger's account was recorded shortly after police arrived. At that point, investigators were faced with a scenario that, on its surface, appeared plausible. An estranged ex-husband with a history of instability, a wife found dead, a husband claiming self-defense, and a second dead man whose injuries were consistent with a violent confrontation. Police conducted an initial assessment based on the information available at the scene. Harrington's background was quickly reviewed. His past relationship with Donnah, his unstable living situation, and his known struggles following the divorce all contributed to early assumptions about motive and behavior. In contrast, Winger had no criminal record. He was a state employee, a father, a homeowner. Nothing in his background immediately suggested that he was capable of staging or committing a double homicide. This contrast mattered. At the scene, Winger did not attempt to flee. He cooperated with officers. He did not change his story during the initial interviews. His demeanor was described as calm and controlled. He expressed concern for his daughter and shock at what he claimed to have discovered. From an investigative standpoint, these factors aligned with a self-defense narrative. The presence of a deceased intruder, combined with a dead spouse and a cooperative homeowner, did not immediately raise red flags that demanded deeper scrutiny that night. Donnah Winger's death was initially attributed to strangulation. The full implications of that finding were not immediately clear in the early hours. Harrington's death, by contrast, was visibly violent and appeared to fit Winger's description of a defensive response. Police documented the scene, collected evidence, and interviewed Winger. At that stage, there was no arrest. The incident was treated as a potential case of justified homicide arising from a domestic intrusion. This initial classification would later prove significant. The lack of forced entry was noted but not immediately seen as contradictory. Harrington was known to Donnah. It was possible, investigators believed at the time, that he had been allowed inside or had gained access without visible damage. The sequence Winger described, Harrington killing Donnah, then attacking him, fit a narrative that required no immediate revision of assumptions. It explained the presence of both victims. It accounted for Harrington's injuries, and it aligned with what officers believed they knew about the individuals involved. However, even in these early moments, some details remained unresolved. The timing of the deaths, the position of Donnah's body, the extent of Harrington's injuries, these elements were documented but not fully analyzed that night. For the purposes of the initial response, Winger's account was accepted provisionally. He was not charged. He was not taken into custody. The case did not move forward as a homicide investigation targeting him. Instead, the focus remained on Harrington as the aggressor and on Winger as someone who had reacted under extreme circumstances. This early acceptance shaped the trajectory of the case. Evidence that might have been examined more aggressively was initially viewed through the lens of Winger's explanation. The narrative provided context for interpreting what officers saw. The night ended without immediate resolution, but with a working theory in place. 2 people were dead. 1 man claimed self-defense, and that claim, at least initially, stood. Only later would investigators return to the events of that night and question whether the sequence described by Mark Winger could withstand closer examination. In the hours and days following the deaths of Donnah Winger and Roger Harrington, the investigation moved forward under a single guiding assumption: that the sequence of events described by Mark Winger was essentially accurate. This assumption did not arise from negligence or indifference. It emerged from a convergence of factors that made his explanation appear plausible, coherent, and consistent with what investigators initially believed they were seeing. When police respond to violent scenes, early interpretations often shape the direction of an investigation long before forensic results are complete. In this case, Winger's version of events provided a clear narrative framework at a moment when answers were urgently needed. He did not deny involvement. He did not minimize the violence inflicted on Roger Harrington. Instead, he acknowledged it openly and framed it as a necessary act to stop an intruder. That transparency mattered. Winger did not appear evasive. He did not refuse to speak. He did not request legal counsel immediately. His willingness to explain what he claimed had happened positioned him, at least initially, as a cooperative party rather than a suspect. Investigators also considered the background of Roger Harrington. Harrington's prior marriage to Donnah, his unstable living situation, and his emotional difficulties following the divorce were known early on. These elements did not prove violent intent, but they created a context in which his presence inside the house could be interpreted as threatening rather than inexplicable. In criminal investigations, context often fills gaps when evidence is incomplete. Harrington's history supplied such context. He had motive, at least superficially. He had access. He had a personal connection to the victim. These factors aligned neatly with Winger's claim that Harrington had broken into the home and attacked Donnah. The lack of forced entry, which might otherwise have raised questions, was explained through that same connection. Harrington knew Donnah. It was plausible that he could have been allowed inside or gained access without damaging doors or windows. Investigators did not initially view the intact entry points as contradictory to Winger's account. At the scene, officers documented what they saw, but the interpretation of those observations was filtered through the accepted narrative. Donnah's body was found in the bedroom, but her positioning did not immediately contradict the claim that she had been attacked there. Harrington's injuries were severe, but they were consistent with a violent confrontation involving a baseball bat, which Winger admitted to using. Crucially, there was no immediate alternative explanation that seemed more compelling. There was no evidence of a third party, no signs of a staged break-in, no obvious indicators of premeditation visible at the surface level. In the absence of such indicators, Winger's account remained intact. Investigators also weighed Winger's personal profile. He was a state employee with no criminal record. He had stable employment. He had a young child in the home. There was no known history of domestic violence. These factors influenced how his statements were received. They did not guarantee truthfulness, but they reduced suspicion in the early stages. This dynamic is not unusual. Law enforcement relies on probability as much as proof in the immediate aftermath of violent events. When a suspect's background aligns with lawful behavior, and when their explanation fits the physical scene reasonably well, that explanation is often provisionally accepted. As a result, certain investigative steps were not pursued aggressively in the first phase. The scene was processed, but not under the assumption that the homeowner was the primary offender. Evidence was collected, but not with the urgency that accompanies cases where deception is suspected from the outset. The medical findings regarding Donnah's death were noted, but their implications were not fully explored immediately. The timing of her death relative to Harrington's was not conclusively established at that stage. Without a clear contradiction to Winger's account, there was no immediate trigger to reopen or challenge the sequence he described. Harrington's death, by contrast, appeared straightforward. The injuries were visible and severe. The weapon was identified. The act was admitted. The question was not whether Winger had killed Harrington, but whether he had been justified in doing so. This distinction mattered. Once a killing is framed as potentially justified, the burden shifts. Investigators must then find evidence that disproves self-defense rather than evidence that establishes guilt from scratch. That shift alters priorities and timelines. In the days following the incident, the case did not advance as an active homicide investigation targeting Winger. He was not arrested. He was not charged. He remained free. The working assumption was that the matter had been resolved, pending routine review. This provisional closure allowed the case to settle. Attention moved elsewhere. Resources were allocated to other investigations. There was no immediate pressure to revisit the scene or challenge the accepted explanation. Yet this early resolution was built on interpretation rather than exhaustive analysis. Certain questions remained unanswered, but they were not seen as urgent. Why was Donnah's death so quiet? Why were there no defensive wounds? Why did the physical layout of the scene not show signs of a prolonged struggle? These questions existed, but they did not override the dominant narrative. They were noted, not pursued. The explanation provided by Winger continued to hold. It is important to understand that this was not the result of a single mistake. It was the cumulative effect of assumptions, context, and timing. Each factor reinforced the others. Harrington's past supported Winger's claim. Winger's demeanor supported the absence of suspicion. The scene itself did not immediately contradict the story. This convergence created what investigators later described as a false sense of clarity. The case appeared resolved because the explanation was coherent, not because it had been tested. As time passed, the deaths of Donnah Winger and Roger Harrington receded from immediate focus. There was no arrest, no public outcry, no demand for further action. The case entered a state of dormancy. For Mark Winger, this meant that his version of events remained the official understanding of what had occurred inside the house on August 29, 1995. For investigators, it meant that the case no longer required active scrutiny. But the story held only because it had not yet been challenged. Years later, when the evidence would be re-examined without the weight of initial assumptions, the same facts would be viewed differently. Details that once seemed inconsequential would take on new significance. Gaps in the narrative would become visible. At this stage, however, none of that had happened. The explanation stood. The case was, for all practical purposes, closed. And that closure would delay the truth far longer than anyone involved realized at the time. For several years, the deaths of Donnah Winger and Roger Harrington remained officially resolved. The explanation given by Mark Winger that he had acted in self-defense after discovering an intruder stood without challenge. There was no arrest, no trial, and no public reconsideration of the events of August 29, 1995. The case existed in records, not in active investigation. That changed when investigators began to re-examine the evidence with distance from the original assumptions. The reopening of the case did not begin with a confession or a new witness. It began with questions, routine questions that had never been fully answered because the case had been provisionally closed too early. When detectives reviewed the file again, they were no longer bound by the urgency or emotional weight of the initial response. They were able to look at the evidence as a sequence rather than a story. The first area of concern involved the timing of the deaths. Medical examiners revisited the autopsy findings, focusing on Donnah Winger's cause of death. She had died from asphyxiation. What drew attention was not just how she died, but when. The medical evidence suggested that Donnah's death may have occurred earlier than originally believed, possibly before the confrontation Mark Winger described with Roger Harrington. If that were true, it would undermine the core of Winger's account. His explanation depended on Harrington killing Donnah first, then attacking him. A shift in the timeline would reverse that sequence entirely. Investigators compared this medical assessment with the physical scene. Donnah's body showed no signs of a prolonged struggle. There were no defensive wounds consistent with a sudden attack by an intruder. Her position on the bed suggested vulnerability rather than confrontation. These details had been documented before, but their significance had not been fully explored. Attention then turned to Roger Harrington's injuries. Harrington had suffered extensive blunt force trauma. The number and severity of the injuries raised questions about whether they could reasonably be explained as the result of a brief, panicked act of self-defense. Some blows appeared excessive. Others suggested sustained force applied after Harrington was already incapacitated. Investigators began to ask whether the force used aligned with fear or with intent. The scene itself also came under renewed scrutiny. Blood patterns were reviewed again. Their distribution suggested movement and sequence. Certain stains indicated that parts of the violence occurred in locations inconsistent with Winger's account. These findings did not conclusively prove guilt on their own, but they challenged the simplicity of the original narrative. Another point of concern involved the absence of forced entry. Initially, this had been explained away by Harrington's familiarity with the household. On re-examination, investigators questioned whether this assumption had been too convenient. If Harrington had entered willingly or been allowed inside, when and why had that occurred? And if he had not, how had he gained access without leaving any trace? The answers were not clear, but the lack of physical evidence supporting an intrusion became harder to ignore when combined with the emerging forensic inconsistencies. As doubts accumulated, investigators expanded their focus beyond the physical scene. They began examining Mark Winger's actions before the incident, rather than only his statements afterward. Telephone records became a key area of interest. Detectives reviewed calls made by Winger in the days leading up to August 29th. They discovered that Winger had been in contact with Roger Harrington shortly before the deaths. This contact had not been emphasized in the original investigation. The nature of these calls raised further questions. Harrington was not randomly present at the house that night. Evidence suggested that he had been lured there. Investigators found indications that Winger had offered Harrington money and assistance, creating a reason for him to come to the house voluntarily. This detail fundamentally altered the interpretation of Harrington's presence. Instead of an intruder acting independently, he appeared to have been summoned. The implications were significant. If Harrington had been invited or coaxed into the home, the narrative of a spontaneous break-in collapsed. His presence would no longer support a self-defense claim. It would suggest planning. Investigators then looked at the sequence of events through this new lens. If Donnah Winger had been killed first and Harrington had arrived afterward, the scene took on a different meaning. The lack of struggle involving Donnah, the timing suggested by forensic evidence, and the controlled nature of the environment all began to align with a staged scenario rather than a chaotic intrusion. The baseball bat, once seen solely as a defensive tool, was reconsidered as a weapon selected and used deliberately. The extent of Harrington's injuries supported this reassessment. Investigators also examined Winger's behavior after the deaths. His calm demeanor, once interpreted as shock or composure under stress, was reinterpreted in light of the emerging evidence. They considered whether his actions were consistent with someone reacting to an unexpected crisis, or with someone following a plan. Each individual inconsistency might have been explainable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. The case was formally reopened. This decision was not made lightly. Reopening a closed case requires confidence that new analysis could lead to a different conclusion. In this instance, the combination of forensic reevaluation, timeline discrepancies, and evidence of pre-incident contact provided that confidence. Once the investigation resumed, the focus shifted fully onto Mark Winger. Detectives reconstructed the events of August 29th based on evidence rather than narrative. They tested Winger's statements against medical findings. They placed phone records alongside estimated times of death. They analyzed movement within the house based on bloodstain patterns. The reconstructed sequence contradicted the original explanation at multiple points. According to this reconstruction, Donnah Winger was killed earlier than Winger had claimed. Harrington arrived later, believing he was responding to an offer of help. He was then attacked and killed. The scene was arranged to suggest a defensive confrontation. This theory accounted for details that the original narrative could not. It explained the timing discrepancies. It explained the lack of forced entry. It explained the severity of Harrington's injuries. It explained why Winger's version had appeared plausible without being accurate. Importantly, investigators did not rely on speculation about motive alone. While personal and financial factors were considered, the case was built on sequence and evidence. The focus was not on why Winger would commit the acts, but on whether the physical and documentary evidence supported his account. By the time the investigation concluded, the doubts that had initially seemed minor had become central. The case no longer hinged on a question of interpretation. It hinged on demonstrable inconsistencies. What had once appeared to be a tragic but justified act now appeared to be something else entirely. The reopening of the case marked a turning point. It transformed a closed file into an active prosecution. It shifted Mark Winger's status from witness to suspect. And it demonstrated how easily an early assumption, once accepted, can delay accountability, until evidence is allowed to speak without the constraints of narrative. The next step would not be another review. It would be a courtroom. The renewed investigation into the deaths of Donnah Winger and Roger Harrington did not end with unanswered questions. Once investigators completed their reconstruction of the events and compiled the forensic, medical, and documentary evidence, the case moved decisively into the legal system. What had once been treated as a justified act of self-defense was now pursued as a double homicide. Prosecutors formally charged Mark Winger with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The charges reflected the prosecution's position that both deaths were intentional and planned, not the result of a sudden confrontation. By the time the case reached court, the narrative that had initially protected Winger had been fully dismantled. The trial focused on evidence rather than character. Prosecutors did not rely on emotional appeals or speculative motives. Instead, they presented a methodical reconstruction of events designed to show that Winger's original account could not coexist with the physical facts. Central to the prosecution's case was forensic timing. Medical experts testified about the estimated time of Donnah Winger's death. Their findings indicated that she had died earlier than Winger claimed, before any alleged struggle with Roger Harrington. This single point was critical. If Donnah was already dead when Harrington arrived, the claim that Harrington killed her collapsed. Expert testimony also addressed the cause of Donnah's death. She had been suffocated. The absence of defensive injuries supported the conclusion that she had been attacked while vulnerable. The prosecution emphasized that nothing in the evidence suggested a spontaneous struggle with an intruder. Roger Harrington's death was examined in equal detail. Forensic specialists testified about the severity and pattern of his injuries. Harrington had sustained multiple blows to the head. The force and repetition of the strikes were inconsistent with a brief, reflexive act of self-defense. Several blows appeared to have been delivered after Harrington was already incapacitated. Bloodstain analysts presented reconstructions of movement inside the house. Their testimony showed how the sequence of violence unfolded across different areas of the residence. The patterns did not support a single chaotic encounter. Instead, they suggested a controlled progression of events. The prosecution also introduced telephone records that had not been emphasized in the original investigation. These records showed contact between Mark Winger and Roger Harrington shortly before the deaths. Investigators testified that Winger had offered Harrington money and assistance, providing a reason for him to come to the house voluntarily. This evidence reframed Harrington's presence entirely. He was no longer portrayed as an intruder acting independently. Instead, he appeared to have been drawn to the location under false pretenses. The lack of forced entry now aligned with a deliberate invitation rather than coincidence. Prosecutors argued that Harrington had been used as part of a plan, both as a victim and as a means to disguise Donnah's murder. They did not need to establish a detailed motive beyond intent and preparation. The focus remained on actions and sequence. The defense challenged these conclusions. Defense attorneys maintained that Winger's original account was truthful and that the prosecution was reinterpreting evidence through hindsight. They argued that forensic timelines are not exact and that self-defense situations can produce excessive force under extreme stress. The defense also emphasized Winger's lack of prior criminal behavior and his consistent statements to police. They suggested that investigators were imposing meaning onto evidence that could be explained in multiple ways. However, the prosecution countered by demonstrating how each piece of evidence aligned when considered together. They did not rely on a single finding. Instead, they showed how the medical evidence, bloodstain analysis, phone records, and scene reconstruction all pointed in the same direction. A key moment in the trial involved the rejection of the self-defense claim. Prosecutors argued that self-defense requires immediacy and necessity. If Donnah was already dead, and if Harrington had been lured to the house, there was no immediate threat to justify lethal force. The defense could not reconcile these contradictions. Jurors were instructed to evaluate whether Winger's explanation was reasonable in light of the evidence, not whether it was possible in isolation. This distinction proved decisive. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Mark Winger was convicted of murdering both his wife, Donnah Winger, and her former husband, Roger Harrington. At sentencing, the court considered the nature of the crimes and the degree of planning involved. The judge noted that the case involved not only the killing of two individuals, but also a deliberate attempt to manipulate the justice system by staging a scene to resemble justified self-defense. Winger was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the jury's determination that the crimes were intentional and premeditated, and that no mitigating factors justified leniency. The legal proceedings concluded without ambiguity. The evidence had been tested through cross-examination. Alternative explanations had been considered and rejected. The verdict rested on documented facts rather than inference alone. In the years since, the Mark Winger case has been referenced as a teaching example in criminal investigations. It illustrates how early assumptions can shape an inquiry and how plausible narratives can delay accountability when they are not immediately challenged. The case is often cited in discussions of crime scene manipulation. Investigators have pointed to it as an example of how staging can exploit expectations, particularly when a suspect's background aligns with perceived normalcy. Importantly, the outcome did not depend on uncovering a hidden confession or a single overlooked witness. It depended on the willingness to revisit evidence without the constraints of the original story. The trial marked the point at which appearance gave way to analysis. The explanation that once held collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was a sequence of actions reconstructed through evidence. The justice system reached its conclusion not through speculation, but through accumulation. Each inconsistency mattered. Each delay mattered. Each assumption mattered. The case stands as a reminder that credibility is not proof, and that the absence of suspicion is not the absence of responsibility. For Mark Winger, the life he had presented, quiet, stable, unremarkable, ceased to define him. What defined him instead were the actions uncovered years later and the evidence that finally brought them into view.